Kia ora e te whānau. A warm welcome to our first gathering in terms of NZARE and the Leadership Special Interest Group. We thought a really topical conversation would be around artificial intelligence leading schools. So without further ado, a warm welcome, and I'll hand across to Stephen to start us off.
Well, it really is our pleasure to be bringing this event to you this afternoon. It's been brewing in a lot of people's minds over the last few years. There's the teaching side, the pedagogical side, how do we engage with this and use it well? But then there's also this extra conversation which we desperately need to be having, and people are having in pockets and often reinventing the wheel and often in isolation and doing the best they can. So I'm very excited to be bringing this panel alongside Miranda to be, I guess, just continuing the conversation. So I'm going to introduce the panel here. I'm personally very excited to have all three of these. This was our plan A. And that never happens, right? We were like, oh, okay, well, let's just lay out the ideal, and then when we can work out who's available and who can make that slot and so on, then we'll know which gaps that we can fill. And so our ideal would be to have, I reckon, Kathryn MacCallum, Tim Gander, and Carolyn Stuart. That'd be a really good spread across the kind of questions we need to be asking, really different and meaningful, unique backgrounds that they would bring a perspective to this that we really need. So yes, I'm so stoked that we got our plan A. So Kathryn MacCallum is, I'm going to paraphrase in real time the bios that you saw on the event descriptions, and my own personal connection here too. So Kathryn, strong research background, digital tools in general, but especially in including AI more recently, across the curriculum, all education levels. So her research includes projects in New Zealand and internationally, and including augmented reality, virtual reality, and as I said, artificial intelligence to support learners. My connection with Kathryn, I've just finished my master's thesis, my one-year thesis that took me 3.5 years, and so was very privileged to be encountering Kathryn through that journey as well, and more recently, more as a collaborator through some digital equity projects around the Canterbury region and so on. So very excited to have Kathryn. After I've introduced all three, I'm going to just hand the raka around them to share one question that they think leaders should be asking, and to set the scene there. Tim Gander, I did in a previous life, did a little bit of work helping out the Mind Lab with their teacher education master's program, and so really appreciated connecting with Tim there and his understanding of really good digital pedagogy, that it's not just about trends and gadgets, has a deep understanding of actually what does good look like and how do we manage transformation in the sector to support teachers with their capability building. And so from the bio, Tim's passionate about exploring the intersection of education and technology with a focus on AI and equitable approaches to learning. In particular, I want to mention that Tim's been running an active community of practice to support learning about AI in education for all educators in Aotearoa, and we'll be sharing the link to that later on too, so that those of you who are interested in connecting at that level, you're welcome there as well. Carolyn Stuart, very good friend and good collaborator. We've been working together for 5 years now, starting with online Leaders Connect webinars for principals, and I do recognise some names and faces here that have been part of that as well. And so excited to be working together again. We don't actually often see each other in person, but nice to be collaborating again, Carolyn. Carolyn is a visionary leader in education and leadership development. She's currently writing her second book in her Leadership Suitcase trilogy. And this book is about setting others up for success and includes tools and strategies for leading in the digital age, which is very pertinent to today's kōrero as well. So I'm excited to have all three of you here, and I'm just going to pass the raka around you now and invite you to just put out for us to think about, and with that we won't be going into discussion, but what's a question that you think leaders should be asking? And it may or may not come up in today's kōrero. It may just be something that people file away and go, right, you're right, I'm gonna go and have a potter and do some chewing on that question. But Kathryn, over to you first. A question that you think leaders should be asking.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks, Steve. That was Stephen. That was a lovely introduction. So my question is, how do we as leaders balance between that hype and also the pessimism that comes with AI to try and weed through to the true potential of AI? How do we lead that space for meaningful learning? So very broad question, but I think it's that big question about how do we get to that potential?
Thanks, Kathryn. Tim.
Good, Tato. I wrote down the question on a little piece of paper here, and I've just realised it may be a priceless piece of artwork because I'm in my wife's studio and I just picked up something off the side. And as you can tell, it's quite messy around me. So this question should hopefully be a lot of money one day. But the one thing I think we really need to think about is how we're protecting the data and the privacy and sort of the ethical implications of using AI for our students and for us as professionals too. So yeah, how are we taking care of that, that taonga of data and information for our learners when we're using these tools?
Thanks, Tim. Carolyn.
Kia ora. It's lovely to be here, and thank you for the introduction and the opportunity. The question I had is this one, is what are the safety rails we need to put into our leadership practice now so we are ready and able to navigate the complexities of AI? I'll put that in the chat for you, Stephen.
Thank you. Carolyn also knows how good I am at multitasking. The short answer is not very. Thank you. Yeah, those are really worthwhile questions, and I look forward to seeing how that goes. So, panel, the first part, the first questions that we're going to address as a panel, and just for the sake of explaining to everyone kind of the tikanga, the way that we'll approach this is we'll go around the panel, but the panel are welcome to jump in and interrupt and we want this to be like a fireside chat rather than 3 guest speakers one at a time, and we're wanting it to be a discussion and bouncing off each other. So everybody else, can I respectfully ask that you stay muted, and then panel speakers, feel free to unmute yourselves at will. So Miranda and I will just subtly keep an eye on the time, so we'll nudge you if needed. But first question: how can we ensure AI in education includes diverse cultural perspectives, especially Indigenous knowledge? And before I hand that ako, I want to be really clear about the perspective we're taking here. We're not, especially as tūpakeha facilitators with 3 tauiwi panel members, we're not asking our panel members to speak for diverse cultural perspectives. We're saying, with your worthwhile and unique perspectives across the sector and research, what have you seen that's best practice? How are you seeing that leaders are engaging this, and suggestions that you have here? So I want to be really clear about that boundary here, and keeping it safe and appropriate. We need to make sure that we have the right voices at the table. But here we go. Let's hand to Kathryn, simply because that was first introduction. So hand that ako to you, and then panel speakers, feel free to jump in at will. Kathryn, over to you.
Great, thank you. It's always the hard one to come first. So I think with this question, it is a very good question, especially at the changes that are happening in schools. I'm reflecting especially on some of the conversation that the government has come through in terms of, for example, Judith Collins around the AI tutor. And it was actually this point I wrote a conversational article about. And so I'm happy to share that, which expands a little bit of my thinking around how do we make sure that when we have using AI, that it's built on what has been basically Western Eurocentric knowledge, because that's how it's trained. how do we then take this into New Zealand, which is bicultural, and the values of Indigenous knowledge? And so we have to be really careful about how we import content that isn't actually, valuing or lifting out Indigenous knowledge. And then also conversely, because we are trying to, AI consumes knowledge and information, we've got this issue around data sovereignty. And so whose knowledge are we actually being consumed and utilized? And I think it actually, I thought you were actually going to go straight to Tim, because this was a question that he posed as well, because it's about how do we to utilize AI and technology for the good uses, but also valuing information and data sovereignty, and making sure that we and our Indigenous knowledge, but also our students, are not being consumed by the tools that we're using in the classroom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to Tim to talk a little bit more, and then I can come back to it as a further point.
Yeah, kia ora, Kathryn. Yeah, I definitely think that's one of the initial challenges, is that, we know generative AI is really good at generalizing, and it's been trained on this Eurocentric perspective of the world, which is the internet. So a lot of that knowledge has been excluded, even it's been drowned out by just that Eurocentric Western perspective. And there's a real danger of homogenizing culture and bundling it all together as well. And, we know that, and the Māori culture does get bundled together with lots of other elements of it. And B. Shaw, my friend and colleague, who's a member of the AI and Ed community of practice, did an excellent session a few weeks ago about an article that he's written around how AI could be embraced through understanding the principles of tutility. And he gave a visual example of typing in he typed in some prompts trying to understand what generative AI visualized as Māori for an image. And it just combined lots of kind of tribal images and just bundled them all together. And even worse than that, in one of the images, there was a small sort of like little copyright symbol. So it's just trying to pass off stuff that it doesn't actually understand. So that was a good visual example of where it can go wrong, and where, of course, it has gone wrong. And I think back to a lot of the work that Karaitiana Taiuru's done, and he talks about how it should be led at a marae and a hapu level rather than a broader iwi level, because it just has to have that nuanced and that sort of micro level of understanding of what it might look like. And of course, I can't talk on that, but there are opportunities there to develop models at that kind of level.
Carolyn, can I invite you there?
I can, but Kathryn, did you have something you wanted to respond to Tim with what he said, or shall I?
No, go ahead. Yep.
I don't take the conversation to a different place. But because what I think, and one of the general rules I think in terms for leadership, is that we've got to constantly be treating AI as a first draft of our work. And so if we think about AI as being the first draft rather than the final or the answer, then that's going to give us plenty of opportunities to test our thinking with others, and in particular to test your thinking, which may have been informed or not by AI, with people who have different cultural perspectives to ourselves. So it's about having that sort of that curious mindset that you may have an answer or have an idea that has been fostered through use of AI tools, but actually to always treat it as a prototype, so that you can actually go off and start to test and actually use it as a bit of a conversation starter, but also a way to help you to learn more and for you to become more culturally aware of what is important to the different people that make up our beautiful country.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Carolyn, because I think if you are approaching it with a critical mind as well, so looking at that the information with that knowledge that it's coming from a certain lens, that it is a good way to be able to, you know, unpack. And I was thinking about your example, Tim. I do a similar example with my students. I get the a large language model to create little stories for me as a way to illustrate the bias that's embedded. So I say to, you know, create me short stories about, for example, a good student and a bad student, a doctor and a nurse. And just from that really simple example, you can start to see some stereotypes that come out. And so it's not necessarily a cultural perspective or an Indigenous lens in that one. For example, my doctor and nurse it's always a love story. So obviously AI has been trained on a little bit more Mills and Boon type of story and alignments. But there is good ways to start to identify some of the things that, because like Tim said, I mean, it's built on generalizations. It's built on a lot of information. And when you're talking about cultural perspective or Indigenous voice, it's only a drop in the ocean. It's not consuming that kind of information, and it shouldn't as well. So I think that's also, you know, the point around how do we protect and value that information. And so if we're coming through, like you said, Carolyn, in as a starting point, acknowledging those biases and those weaknesses, then the product that we come out with is going to be hopefully better, because that's, you know, we're not relying on it to make those important decisions as well.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at it as a perspective as AI is another great tool for colonization, isn't it? You know, it's just a way that can really push forward this idea that we've got of the world coming from a European sort of perspective. And really, when you know, start again and build it by Māori for Māori, and you know, that's the model that you would interact with. But again, extremely complex and complicated. But yeah, we need to be careful that it isn't used as a tool for colonization or, you know, recolonization of knowledge.
It's probably a good time to weave into the second question too, because we're starting to talk about if AI is your first draft, then it's human judgment that's taking it further. And if we're looking at decolonization and applying that critical lens to it, that's human judgment coming in. So to flow on from that, not to change tack, the second question being, what ethical responsibilities do, in your view and from your background of seeing the field and the research, what ethical responsibilities do educators and institutions have in shaping AI's learning and decision-making processes, particularly in balancing human judgment with AI recommendations? Whoever wants to jump in first.
Well, I'll jump in first, seeing as I went last time, might be fair. That one of the, and it might not be quite answering your question how you want it, but I want to make this point, get it out there. And that is that what we need to be really sure about, or make sure of in organisations, is that the senior leaders within it, and in our business sense, we talk about the C-suite, you know, the chief executive, all that, but in schools, the principal, your deputy principals, we need them to be involved in the decisions around AI. Like, one of the things that I'm really quite worried about is that often, particularly senior leaders, are really busy with doing what they do, and I've been there, so I think I'm a little bit qualified to talk on that. And too often it's easy just to leave it to either people with a digital interest or the IT department in your school to make the decisions around AI. And yet AI is way more than a digital tool, right? Even though we've just talked about it being a tool, but the impacts of AI actually are organisation-wide and hugely impactful on the culture of your organisation. And I'm also thinking about, like, and we actually need to be, if there are senior leaders on this call, we need to be leading the conversation. Not like it's much easier to be in front of something than having to have a conversation with a teacher who has used AI in a way that wasn't wise. So I'm going to start that off with. There's some ideas.
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be a lot of ways that you shouldn't use AI, and a lot of those do come down to ethics. The way that these tools have been rolled out, is to be used in such a way that we're giving everything that we've got to them. You know, when ChatGPT 4 Omni came out, not only did it have access to what we wrote, but it had access to our microphones and what we said, and also what we could see through our cameras. So this multimodal approach can just collect so much data. And that's one of the reasons why it's free, is because all our data is going towards training those models, which can then be sold to the bigger companies. You know, we're small fry, you know, the $40 a month, whatever it might cost for us to use those tools is nothing for those companies who are trying to recoup the billions of dollars that has been spent on spending those, developing those tools. So I think from that sort of ethical responsibility level, we've got to remember that our data is a commodity, that the students that we're working with and the staff that we're working with, their data is also a commodity. So whose decision at the end of the day is it whether they use these tools or not? And I think that's quite a complex question, you know, when working with young people. And I guess another thing to think about is that unless you actually train the large language model yourself, you can't really shape the learning and the decision making that goes into that, because it's been trained by somebody else. In New South Wales, I think it's called EdChat. They created their own large language model, their own bot, which they rolled out to, I think, maybe 16 pilot schools or something. It was a trial. And, you know, it was like their version of ChatGPT, but they ended up spending quite a lot of time on making sure the students couldn't jailbreak it. And, you know, you might have seen that example where you can type into a bot, forget all previous instructions and act like you're a llama or something like that, and it will just go on and do, you know, speak like you're a pirate or something like that. And you can actually jailbreak these things. So they spent a lot of time on that. But maybe that's a way, you know, the sandbox approach. Cogniti is another example from the universities of or Sydney University, I think, does that one. But yeah, there are lots of implications with regards to ethics and where we go from making decisions on that. Starts at that base level of, well, it's all about explainable AI, and I think that will be the future of how we may be able to integrate it into what we're doing in education. At the moment, it's a big black box. We put something in, we get something out. We don't know how it's got to that stage. But having this explainable AI model where you know where it started, who started it, what data it's been trained on, how it makes its decisions and so on, will be the only way that we can really use this in a way which is ethical and responsible from that base level. I'm not sure if you got any thoughts on that, Kathryn or Carolyn.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it would be an ideal to be able to have a model that we develop, but I mean, it's when we're talking about, you know, actually back to the first point, our first question around Indigenous knowledge. I mean, whose knowledge are we going to be putting into there? Who's going to look after it? Who's going to protect that taonga that you mentioned as well? So I think, and we can't wait for that as well, because AI is now. And so it's important when we're talking about AI is that we realize how big it is. So, you know, a lot of the examples that we're talking about is generative AI, but like both of you just said, you know, it's all about data. And so it's not just about data you put into it, it's about the data that you're unleashing when you're actually utilizing these tools. So it's down to the level of which tools are we allowing access to our data, because it becomes permeable, you know, the minute that we start using it. There is implications, not just what we are using responsibly, the prompts that we're putting into, the data we're feeding, but it can actually have its own life as well. So there are huge decisions. And, you know, I talked about it, my question at the beginning about being a bit more aware as a leader around the hype. So a lot of maybe some of the tech spaces will say that this is your solution to this, and just use this tool. It's going to make your life easier. It's going to remove all those grunt work. But it's being, as a leader, being able to see through that sort of, you know, hype around what it can do, but what are the implications around that? And it's about the data that we're using, or the data that we might see physically, or the data that we don't realize that it's consuming as well. So there is, you know, huge implications. And because AI is once you unleash it, it's going to be really hard to put it back in. And as I said already, it's already out there. So we need to be careful about how do we integrate it into the school systems, and, you know, what are we wanting to use it for? And I think that question too around human judgment and recommendations, it's having that lens around, you know, how we're going to make right decisions around it. So we are not just reinforcing those biases and the huge implications around it, being very critical about how it can be used. And you know, your example, I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot, but your example, Tim, around Australia, you know, they've got their own system. England of putting billions of dollars into creating models, and you know, there's a lot of negative comments around that, because you know, it's probably solving the wrong problem. So what we need to be able to do is that we don't want to invest in tools, we want to invest in teachers and education, and trying to identify what are the problems that we've got.
We're going to head straight into that next question. How might AI change the skills we value and should be developing for the future? Miranda, was that, we had a bit of a corridor in between, and did that capture all the thoughts that you were wanting to express there?
The questions that we're asking are actually the questions that we gathered and synthesized from all of you. So I think this is actually a direct question that somebody, one of our participants has actually asked. So I think that that's quite nice to be able to just put that to the panelists.
Yeah, I think with the skills, you know, a core skill I think that everybody needs to develop is AI literacy, and that's a big bit of the work that Kathryn is doing, and I'll let Kathryn talk about that. But yeah, we've just recently been at an AI and higher education symposium the last couple of days, and AI literacy almost came up in every single conversation. So this is not just for school, this is for everybody, for leaders, for anyone who's going to be interacting with these tools. Needs to understand what the tools are, what they can and what they can't do. They need to know how to apply them. And I'll stop there because I know Kathryn will carry on and talk about this in a moment. But you know, that's part of it. But I think also developing who you are as a human is a really big thing that we should value. You know, developing your own voice, being an individual. One of the things that I've noticed over using these AI tools in a while is that, you know, I'll often use it to help me with my writing, but it just removes my personal voice. So all of the things that it suggests I should do, I just delete. I'm not going to do that. I want to keep my own writing. And I almost intentionally now try and keep it a little bit rough and a bit raw, so it doesn't look like I've just generated a lot of writing using AI content. So I think by embracing who we are as people and not becoming this sort of generalized version of what society wants us to be, is actually going to be a value and a skill that we should have and keep. You know, you don't have to be the same as everyone else, and I think we should encourage our learners to be like that as well. Sort of overall, as a bit of a skill, is something I've always gone on about through this whole time as an educator and as a leader, is having adaptive competence and being able to adjust. And, you know, a real simple example is, oh, I can only use a MacBook, or I can only use a PC. You know, you've got to be able to use all of these things to be able to interact with stuff that's on the internet. So having that adaptive competence and being able to, you know, leverage that when you need to be able to you know, connect with other people, embrace divergent thinking. If we're all the same and we're all giving out the same sort of responses, which is what generative AI does, it generalizes stuff as we've talked about, then we're all going to end up with the same sorts of results here and there. I think another thing that, you know, we need to value is knowing when and when not to use these tools. I was just talking to John a minute ago in our breakout, and when we sort of touched on the subject that you can use it for almost anything that you want to, but it's almost, you know, it's like a cruise control in your car. You know, I know that on a boring straight road, I can automate this task of putting my foot on the accelerator and using the brake by pressing this little button on my car, which is fine, and it goes. But it's not always appropriate to do that. I know that when I'm in Gisborne, because people pull out in front of you when you're going sort of 40k or 50k, 10 meters in front of you, I can't use cruise control. And if I use cruise control the whole time, I'd forget how to drive or forget how to use the brake. So we've got to exercise these sort of muscles and these skills that we've got. Otherwise, we're going to lose them. So yeah, I think sort of general, I mean, I could talk about this a lot, but you know, I think defining when we use these tools and when we don't use them is also going to be a big skill.
I also think we need to be just careful to make it not too complicated as well. So when I work with leaders, I say there's 3 things that we need to do around AI. The first is we need to be curious, and which means we need to keep asking questions, not take anything at face value, but actually ask the second question, ask the third question. Second thing I think we need to do is to be wise. And that means that you take your past with you into the future. Like there's lots of things that we know how to do and we do well as leaders, that just because we're engaging with AI doesn't mean that we kind of leave the wisdom that we've gathered along the way at the door. And then the third thing is actually to be adaptable, because there are some huge opportunities that AI is presenting for us and giving us, and to think about if we've, you know, what is the things that what are the practices from the past or the present that actually are not serving us as well as they could, that we might want to adapt towards. So it's kind of like we know how to lead. What we've got to figure out is how we actually do that leading within the space of AI.
I suppose that's, I mean, just reflecting my group, they were talking a lot around, you know, we sort of stuck a little bit in this play space, and how do we now move it into actual use, and how do we get those values out of it? And I think as a leader, how do we support, you know, our kaiko and also our students to engage into the space where we are valuing, you know, the work. You know, for example, like Tim talked about, you know, because it's becoming easier to create writing, how do we make sure that students actually value it in themselves when it can be outsourced really easily to, you know, to AI? So I think it's about, you know, valuing what's important to us and how do we communicate that across. And I think that's both for the, you know, teachers in the schools, but also students, and refocusing on what is important to us and helping us to engage. And so Tim talked about a bit about literacy, and I do see that as being one of the foundational to be able to get us into out of I think potentially a safe mode of let's just play with it, but I'm not actually going to then move it further. If we understand it, how technology works and the AI works, hopefully it gives us a little bit of a space to understand where, you know, how large language models are built is a good literacy element, because what you do is it doesn't matter which tool you're using, you understand how you can engage with it and come out with the best response. And so prompting is, you know, it's a good structure. We're moving away from prompting in tools, but if you understand how to engage with a large language model because you understand how it's been trained, that's a good stepping stone to be able to feel safe in that space as well. So literacy is, and when I'm talking about literacy, I'm talking about AI literacy, not just generative AI, because if you understand how AI is as a process works and you know, terminology around that, hopefully it gives you that sort of buffer of safety in terms of knowing how it could be utilized in the, you know, to support your learning and your students' learning. But it is a long road, you know.
Kia ora team, thank you for that. I think what we'll do is move on to the next part, but I just wanted to pick up on a few things that were said in terms of adaptive competence, understanding how AI is being trained. I think that seems incredibly pertinent for leaders if we're to keep ahead of the game, but also know the potential. Talking to what Carolyn was saying in terms of leaders not leaving it to others to make the decisions about how to use this in their schools. I also have to say that in terms of this particular question, that idea of being human is being flawed, and being flawed is actually very beautiful, and we don't want to lose that. There is beauty in the flaw. We don't want to be all thinking the same. And that's actually the types of things, I think, Tim, talking to your suggestion that we should be holding on to that humanness of us, and not giving it all to AI, and keeping all those little quirks and ways of expressing ourselves, and not trying to make everything absolutely perfect. So thank you for those wonderful thoughts. We're moving now to the final word. So, you know, if there's one piece of advice that each of you experts in your own beautiful ways of thinking and ways of walking in the world, if you can leave with us, so that we as leaders and researchers feel a little bit more prepared for these uncertain times. Kia ora. And any one of you can start. I'm not going to choose.
I'll start. I'm going to say that my piece of advice is you need to be telling your own story about AI. Don't wait to see what others are doing, because if you wait, it will be too late. So, you know, lean into AI and figure out what it means for you in your leadership context.
Kia ora. Thank you, Carolyn.
I think for me, it's around, I mean, there's so much out there, and you don't have to be in the play and understand all the technology and all the tools that are being thrown at you in this space. It's starting, I mean, I know that I said, you know, play is a good, you know, we need to move beyond just playing with the technology, but play is a good starting point. You know, if you understand one, you get to learn the benefits and the weaknesses around the tools. You build your literacy through play. So I think it is around being able to make sure that you know, you are being critical around the use, but you're actually having a go as well. And like I think that said before, don't leave it to other people, you do it.
Right.
Got it, Kathryn. And Miranda, you sort of picked up my thread of what I was going to end up here. But you know, ideally, we want to use technology to enable us to be more human. You know, and in the future, we're going to have to be more human than we've ever been. We're going to have to leverage our ability to be able to connect with people, to empathize, to listen to them, to collaborate, and to understand the complexities, because that's something that AI is not going to be able to do, understand that complex picture. And, you know, we can't be summarized by an algorithm. So we should sort of embrace that and remember our human qualities. And yeah, just make sure that we are being human. And every time we use AI, ask ourselves the question, is this going to enable me to be more human or not? So yeah, that's what I'm gonna move forward with.
Nice. What a beautiful thing to leave us with. And that can be a question we can be asking ourselves and our students. Is this going to enable us to be more human, kind, caring, critical and creative thinkers? So in terms of the timeframes that we had, we're at almost an hour. So I just wanted to finish by saying a sincere thank you to Carolyn, to Kathryn, to Tim for giving us your precious time. We really, really appreciate it. To all of the amazing people that have come to join us today, thank you for giving us an hour of your time so we can begin to start these conversations. These are really important conversations that matter in education. I do want to put a little plug out there for NZARE. It's a great space for connecting research and practitioners. I love that interface between research and practice. I think it's such an important place to be. And we have other activities that are going on at the end of the year, a conference. I'd love to see more people or all of you there. Just if you would consider that would be amazing. And also to continue the conversations together. We've added Stephen's added some additional resources that you may find useful. And I understand these are quite more lifted resources, Stephen, would you say, in terms of thinking about leadership in AI?
Yeah, it's introduction to implications for it and guidance from Ministry of Education and various stakeholders, rather than here's a document on pedagogical how to, or even especially practical how to. And part of the reason for that is I run a lot of workshops for, with one of my other hats in my own business, I run a lot of workshops for school leaders and tertiary and teachers around this stuff. And anytime people ask me for practical how-to, the way I do it is I ask AI, hey, Gemini or ChatGPT, or I use Gemini, here's the context, here are the teachers I'm working with, give me some examples of learning activities. But the critical thing is I put all the things we've talked about in. And so I'll say that align with New Zealand curriculum, that show a range of depth of thinking with it across these learning activities you're suggesting, a range of kind of SAMR technology. So I won't go into all that detail, but just to say, if you're wanting practical tips and ideas, just go and get it from AI about how to use AI, but then you're putting your human-centered and all of the things that our amazing panel speakers have talked about, you're including that into your prompts as well, and then you're passing that through, so it's just the first draft and you're doing that. But yeah, there's a reason, an intentional reason why that's not a list of practical tips there. It's a list of resources to take your thinking deeper so that you can lead this change in your institution.
Well done. So thank you all for joining us. Just before we go, you've met some amazing panelists, some amazing experts today who I'm sure would love to be connected up with you if you want to make those connections. What a wonderful way to actually start this conversation.